Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes, probably till 12:03, just to let the room fill in a little. So just hang back, introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. We'll get started shortly. And I'll keep doing this announcement for just a couple more minutes. Welcome, everyone, to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to give it to about 12:03 just to let the room fill in a little. So just hang back, introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like, and we will get started shortly. Hello, welcome to those of you that are just joining us. We're going to get started shortly in just a bit, so feel free to hang tight. We're almost there. We're going to get started at 12:03, so just 2 more minutes. Welcome everyone that's just joining us. We're just waiting for the room to fill. We're going to get started shortly at 12:03, so just in 1 minute. Welcome to those of you that are just joining. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. Thank you for joining. Cool. So it's 12:03, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining today for the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. Hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Hermann Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative. And in my role, I get to engage with our supporters through events, through volunteer opportunities, really anytime someone's talking to the organization. And now I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A box as we go throughout the presentation. But we won't answer those until the end. The webinar is also being recorded and we'll send out the recording along with the slide deck out to everyone that's registered. So no need to worry about that. You'll get everything in your inbox shortly after. So just a little bit about what we'll cover today. We're going to be talking about why TechEquity exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address our region's most pressing economic issues. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk about why we're here. So TechEquity got started because some of its earliest founders and members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods, and they understood that there was this perception that tech workers were the cause of the problem. So they noticed things such as rising rents, increases in displacement, increases in traffic, and people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others within their networks, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns and that they as tech workers were uniquely positioned to help contribute to solutions to the issues that they were seeing around them. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on low-income people and communities of color. And many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. And at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. So As a result of this, the pandemic really has a potential to even further exacerbate inequality that our region was already suffering from. So, because of this affordability crisis, our communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, growing up in the Bay Area my whole life, I've been able to see both sides of the coin. So, we have friends and family that are worried about, all the changes they're seeing in their communities and what that means for them. But also, I have friends and family who have pursued jobs within the tech sector and have found lots of success for themselves and for their families alike. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame, it starts to create us versus them dynamics that's further dividing our community. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide in our communities. So while we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal that's caused by the pandemic, it's important to realize, like I said before, that many in the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed because more than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty. So this is the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area. I think the fact that rents are rising really isn't a surprise to anyone on this call because we all know this, we feel this, we've heard about this from friends and family. And while some Californians are very successful in our tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants have actually decreased slightly throughout the years. So we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based as an organization and that's where tech is headquartered. But a version of this story is playing out all throughout the country. And it's really a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success and without tech being at the table to work together to address our shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members are frustrated, like we just talked about. So before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims spiked to 16%, which is a more dramatic spike than our last recession. So in the span of 1 month, we lost decades worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. So at TechEquity Collaborative, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone. But it's clear that it won't happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities. And we have to show up and we have to do so in partnership with those in our community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. At TechEquity, we believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to the issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. So we all know we can do this, and the first step is to show up, and you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar today to engage on the conversation. Second here, sorry about that. So our goal is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. So we believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. And we help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. And we do that through a variety of ways, such as book club discussions, panel discussions, webinars such as these, and voter guides that we produce around election seasons. We advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. So a perfect example of this is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which we work together with community leaders, city leaders, and people on the ground to fight for protections for 8 million California renters, fighting unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice aiming to turn companies into agents of change and agents of equity in the broader community. So we do that through corporate partnerships and engagements with companies. Sorry about that. So tech workers have outsized political power that's largely untapped when it comes to public policy and advocacy. So connecting tech workers and outside perspectives builds more empathy and ethical practice in our workplaces, in our products, and in surrounding communities. So at TechEquity Collaborative, our two key issue areas are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of this, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in a variety of ways, because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agenda to these new realities. So while the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy and in our communities for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity within our neighborhoods. This affordability crisis is decades in the making, and the policy choices we've made over the course of decades have set us up for this level of pain our communities are feeling, especially now with the pandemic. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area, in California, and all across the country. And that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, that was a federal agency at the time, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And this policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined, as we could see with those red blocks on the map of San Francisco. And those communities that were deemed risky investments or redlined didn't receive any investment. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and that really is by no accident, because the hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So in other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy, and it made it hard for homeowners and residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. So there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. The crisis we're living in is decades in the making, as we talked about, way before tech, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. There are many cases across California and across the country. So these are examples of redline neighborhoods within Austin and Atlanta. And once again, those are those red chunks you see on your screen. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from being able to access this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many people who lived in redline neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And an income shock can be like you suddenly lose your job, your car breaks down, you have a huge medical expense, and it impacts almost 1 out of 2 Californians. So 46% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates. So 63% of African-American households are in liquid asset poverty, and 67% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why all this is happening, but many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a better role in supporting better policies moving forward. The twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing, and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcome of the pandemic, many people in our communities, as we talked about, were already struggling. And as pandemic recovery continues to be starkly uneven and equal, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. As we can see, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. So according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement or unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. So this means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. And while all workers have lost out because of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. And while there's a gap between worker pay and productivity, like we just talked about, there's also a pay gap between race. So white men are earning more cents to the dollar. That's that orange bar on the left side of your screen in comparison to Black men and women, the two blue bars on the right side of your screen. And because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less and disproportionately, they're not able to afford to live in cities that are providing good jobs. So the cost of living here were already high. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. This is what it takes to afford the average 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. So if you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average 2-bedroom working a normal, regular 8-hour day. However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you'd need to work 40 hours a day to be able to afford that 2-bedroom. Again, that's 40 hours a day. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're setting up an impossible situation for low wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work in. And the problem persists all across the country. Even though costs in burgeoning tech cities like Austin, Denver, and Atlanta aren't as high, the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone earning minimum wage. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside of the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making 6 figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, bus drivers, who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford your apartment, right? But why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due to lack of supply. And this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build in order to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, and that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. That's that big blue bar on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable to people making that good salary we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. Those are the 2 bars on the left side of your screen. And as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and further away from supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from our region altogether. So remember when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing. It's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. Because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities while folks with higher income are coming in and staying in. So this chart is showing us how people in lower incomes, those are those orange bars, have left San Francisco at higher rates, while people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And people beneath 30% AMI are in a more drastic situation where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco as they're being pushed into homelessness or worse. So that's why that last blue bar at the bottom of the chart is actually increasing, because there isn't enough affordable housing available to help support our most vulnerable members in our community. And amongst people of color, the rates of displacement are even more tragic. So as we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are living in liquid asset poverty at higher rates, and Black and Latino populations have been leaving San Francisco at higher rates over the past couple of years. The combination of discriminatory housing laws, low wages, lack of affordable housing production have really created a crisis of displacement. And displacement, as we can see, is driven by bad policy choices. And we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. And the folks that are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by this crisis. And we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. But the good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together and alongside non-tech community members. And together we can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems. And we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity in our tech economy. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is a result of years and years of bad policy choices. But the good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. We envision a world in which a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities better places to live. So we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve this vision without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis. And that starts with production. Building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability, like we just talked about. And we could do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of housing, constructing housing, by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build. Preservation, making sure that we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. Protection. We need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time to build the amount of housing that we need, but in the meantime, we need to make sure that tenants are protected from displacement. Racial equity. So racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially in housing. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing. So we have to craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. Especially now, we have to be thinking about short-term and long-term solutions to preservation and protection. Many of our neighbors, as we talked about, are more at risk now than ever due to the pandemic. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in their surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits, regardless of the role a person is in. And we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse employees, and contracted workers. So in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we have created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, making sure the workplace is safe, and ensuring that there is fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. Training as a standalone approach will not lead us out of inequality and will not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. In order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards, and protections for all jobs, innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. And at the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures everyone has the basics to survive. And we must strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved. We host tons of educational events. So next Thursday, we'll be talking about how tech can hire formerly incarcerated folks. And on October 28th, we'll be talking about what policies we can support to ensure affordability, that there's affordability and accessibility in housing. If you're interested in public policy, you can check out our priority legislation page to check out some of the bills we were supporting this year with our membership. We were supporting bills along rental registry, extending paid family leave. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slides. And for corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get more involved in these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So you can reply to our follow-up email and we can connect you with our corporate partnerships manager if you're interested in that. So this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in, but making sure that we're still building community in the process of doing so. So this year, we're excited to continue our work in the housing and labor spaces through creating ethical workforce practices in tech, tackling algorithmic bias in housing that further drives inequality and upholds systemic racism in the housing market, and crucial housing policies that are protecting and bringing relief to our most vulnerable communities. So what can you do today? You can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can support us financially by becoming a member for $10 a month or $100 a year, or you can take action with us through our volunteer opportunities and our volunteer programs, whether that be a civic tech volunteer where you're donating your skills, your time to civic tech projects, or you can join us on the policy side of it through our priority legislation, which I'll talk about what we were working on this year. So this year we worked on the rental registry. So at TechEquity Collaborative, we're committed to getting better data about our housing market, and better data means that we can build more accurate policy interventions and ensure help is being targeted to people who need it the most. TechEquity is working on a number of campaigns to get better data on housing and ensure that data is being used fairly through our rental registry and algorithmic bias in housing initiatives. So this year we ran a bill, AB 1188, that unfortunately stalled out in the legislative process this year, but we plan to continue to pursue establishing a rental registry and making sure that, if you all support this, that you subscribe to our newsletter, join our Slack so that you can stay up to date on any new initiatives around rental registry. We also had a bunch of different other bills that we were working on this legislative cycle that relate to our core issues of housing and workforce and labor. So we decided this year to focus our advocacy on these bills that you see on the screen because they would have the most to ensure an affordable home, a family sustaining job, and a true safety net are available to all Californians. So if you'd like more information on these bills, I'll be including a link to our priority legislation page, which will have more information on what the bill was, the status of the bill, and how you can support future endeavors in the next legislative cycle. On upcoming events, as I mentioned, we have 2 upcoming events which you can register for, and many more to come in the next couple of months. The first event is called System Reset: How Tech Can Recruit, Hire, and Retain People Returning from Incarceration. So we'll learn how systemic racism affects employment and incarceration, what role tech can play in interrupting this dynamic, and how companies can make a plan to recruit, hire, and retain people returning from incarceration. So that event is next Thursday from 5 to 6 p.m. It's an evening event. And the second event we have coming up this month is called Accessibility Design in Housing, where we'll learn from accessibility design experts about their work and how we can develop housing policies and design standards to ensure that housing is both affordable and accessible for everyone. So as I mentioned, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can become a member for $10 a month, $100 a year, or you can take action with us in whatever way you'd like. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information to absorb. So now is the time for any questions you may have. Feel free to drop those into the Q&A. You can also ask questions in the follow-up email if something comes out. So if you're a little bit unsure as to how you'd like to participate or what volunteer opportunities we have available, I do recommend that you all just reach out to me and I can point you and plug you into the right place. I'll just take a couple minutes to see if anything pops in the chat. And like I said, this will all be, this was recorded. This will go out to you all in your inboxes shortly this afternoon. So just keep an eye out for that. Cool. I'm not seeing any questions, which is totally fine. Like I said, let me know in the follow-up email if you all have any question that comes out later. You can join our Slack channel, join us, subscribe to our newsletter. I want to thank everyone for your time. I hope you feel inspired to join our organization in whatever capacity and hope to see you at a future event. So just want to thank everyone and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.